Hello, my name is Craig Allen. I am the president of the U.S.-China Business Council, and I thought it might be useful to give a quick report on a recent trip to China. I attended the China Development Forum in Beijing last week and also made a trip to Zhejiang and Shanghai. At the China Development Forum, I have to say I was really impressed at all of the momentum behind reform in China. There was a great deal of discussion of supply-side economics, tariff reductions, tax reductions, VAT reductions, free trade, the negative list for investment, the importance of the private sector, and the importance also of intellectual property rights as a spur to innovation. It was a remarkable sign of the energy of the reform movement in China, and something that I truly did appreciate. In my visits with Chinese government officials, I saw exactly the same type of enthusiasm for economic reform. I had the honor to visit the governor of Zhejiang province with a number of our members. And indeed, the governor was anxious to resolve any of the problems of our members who had invested in his province. Indeed, he suggested a MOU, or an agreement between the U.S.-China Business Council and the province to address future problems when they were to come up. I really appreciate that problem-solving ethos by senior members of the Chinese government. And indeed, I saw it throughout my visit in Shanghai, Zhejiang, and Beijing. A couple of specific things I would like to report out. We met at a very senior level at the National Development and Reform Commission, or NDRC, to discuss the negative list for investment and problems associated with the foreign investment law. I was very gratified to hear that the number of areas restricted from foreign investment in China would be gradually reduced. And we're expecting in the not distant future for the current list of 48 industries restricted from foreign investment to be reduced. On the foreign investment law also, we were encouraged to communicate with the NDRC and with MOFCOM on detailed proposals or detailed problems that American companies have as they try to interpret the regulations and as they plan to implement the new regulations, and in particular as they plan to expand their investments in China. We had a number of very good discussions on the difficult subject of cybersecurity and cross-border data flows. I was honored to be received by the chief engineer at the Cyber Administration of China, as well as the People's Bank of China, to discuss data flows and personal information and how that would be protected in the future. Now, clearly, these are subject areas where there's a great deal of work being done in China currently. And thus, I think it is particularly important for American companies to express their views on the problems that they may have in trying to implement and be fully in accord with Chinese law. Sometimes Chinese law can be overlapping. And in that case, the American companies need the opportunity to reflect the practical difficulties that they have in implementing the law. It is important to have this type of regulatory conversation between the American companies and the regulators, preferably before the laws are put into place, but certainly during the draft period. And as implementation is going forward, It's important that American companies are able to implement in a manner that is economical, efficient, and not necessarily wasteful as they try to meet the needs of different Chinese administrative entities. So we were grateful for that conversation. We also had a very good conversation on intellectual property rights with the Supreme People's Court of China. The Supreme People's Court of China has established a new intellectual property rights chamber, and we met with the chief judge at that chamber. I have to say, having worked on intellectual property rights in China for 30 years, they have made enormous progress. And the new chamber within the Supreme People's Court is poised to be an efficient and effective chamber to hear appeals from the lower courts on intellectual property rights cases. I was deeply impressed by how much this chamber uses technology to allocate cases to the most knowledgeable judges, and also to keep the public informed. The Supreme People's Court is making a very impressive effort at being transparent, mostly to the Chinese people, but that also helps American companies significantly. Finally, we met with a number of the Chinese ministries that are directly involved in the trade negotiations between the United States and China. And I was deeply impressed at how pragmatic they are and how much they realize that working with Ambassador Lighthizer and with President Trump is actually in China's interest over the longer term. How, in particular, there is an increasing realization that state-owned enterprises in China are actually acting as a drag on economic growth, and that encouraging or nurturing both private sector Chinese investment and foreign direct investment in the industries currently dominated by the state-owned economic enterprises will lead to greater economic growth in China. Indeed, China has a choice to make between greater control through tight control of the state-owned enterprises or more growth through more investment, both by private sector Chinese companies and by foreign direct enterprises in the economies that are in the sectors that are currently excessively dominated by groups of Chinese state-owned enterprises. Will it be more growth or more control? We are hopeful that the Chinese government will choose more growth. And we are confident that an agreement between Ambassador Lighthizer and Vice Premier Liu He, between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, could lead to a positive outcome for both countries. Thank you.